Good evening, and welcome back to Boring History Narrative. Tonight we are going somewhere that no longer exists. Not a ruin you could visit, not a foundation you could trace with your fingers in the dirt, but a place that vanished so completely that for 2,000 years afterward, people have only been able to argue about what it once contained. A harbour city on the edge of Egypt. A lighthouse so tall that sailors said they saw its fire from 40 miles out at sea, and somewhere inside that city, behind walls that no longer stand, a room or a wing, or perhaps an entire complex of rooms, that once held more human knowledge in one place than had ever been gathered before, and arguably more than would be gathered again for over 1,000 years afterward. If you are enjoying what we do here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you might think, and it means stories like this one keep finding the people who need them at the end of a long day. And before we begin, drop your location and your local time into the comments below. Whether it is past midnight in Manila or just past dinner in Manchester, there is something quietly comforting about knowing that people all over the world are settling into the same story together. You might even help a fellow insomniac find their way here, so get comfortable. Adjust the pillow. Let your shoulders drop just slightly from wherever they have been holding tension all day. Tonight we drift back to the Egyptian coastline in the centuries after Alexander the Great, to a city built on sand and ambition, to a library that became a symbol of everything human curiosity could achieve, and to a fire, or perhaps several fires, that became a symbol of everything that curiosity could lose. The city of Alexandria did not exist before 331 BC. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because so much of what came afterward depended on it. There was no ancient fishing village slowly growing into greatness here. No centuries of organic development the way Athens or Memphis had grown. Alexandria was planned. It was drawn on a surveyor's grid before a single building stood, laid out by a Greek architect named Dinocrates of Rhodes at the explicit instruction of Alexander himself, who passed through this stretch of the Egyptian coast during his campaign of conquest, and recognized, with the kind of strategic eye that had already carried him from Macedonia to the edge of India, that this particular spot was valuable beyond its appearance. It sat between the Mediterranean Sea and a brackish lake called Mareotis, with a narrow island just offshore called Pharos that could be connected to the mainland by a causeway and used to shelter not one but two harbours. It had access to the Nile through canals, which meant access to the grain wealth of Egypt's interior, and it faced north and west toward Greece and Rome, rather than east toward the older centres of Egyptian civilization at Memphis and Thebes. Alexander named it after himself, which was not an unusual habit for him, and then he left. He never saw the city that would carry his name into a level of fame he could not have entirely predicted, because he died less than a decade later in Babylon, far from the Egyptian coast, at the age of 32, leaving behind an empire with no clear successor and several ambitious generals who had spent years learning from him exactly how far ambition could carry a person. What happened next is sometimes called the Wars of the Successors, and it is its own enormous and bloody story, full of betrayals and battles, and at least one occasion where Alexander's own body was hijacked mid-funeral procession by a general who wanted the prestige of burying him. That general's name was Ptolemy, and he is the reason any of the rest of this story happens at all. Ptolemy had been one of Alexander's closest companions since childhood, had fought beside him through the entire campaign across Persia and into India, and when the empire fractured after Alexander's death, Ptolemy claimed Egypt for himself. This was, in retrospect, the single shrewdest decision made by any of Alexander's former generals. Egypt was wealthy, defensible behind its deserts and its single navigable river, and already accustomed to being ruled by outsiders who borrowed local legitimacy while running things their own way. Ptolemy settled into Egypt, eventually took the title of king, and founded a dynasty that would rule the country for nearly 300 years, ending only with his descendant Cleopatra and the arrival of Rome. It was Ptolemy, and more specifically Ptolemy and the small circle of advisors and scholars he gathered around himself in those early years, who decided that Alexandria needed something more than docks and granaries and a palace. They decided it needed to become the intellectual capital of the entire Greek-speaking world, and they decided to build that reputation deliberately, the way you might construct a building, rather than waiting for it to accumulate naturally over centuries the way it had in Athens. This is one of the most unusual features of the whole story. The Library of Alexandria was not an organic outgrowth of a long scholarly tradition. It was a project conceived and executed with state resources by a royal court that understood, with remarkable clarity for its time, that knowledge itself could be a form of power, prestige, and political legitimacy, every bit as valuable as soldiers or grain reserves. The intellectual architect of this project, at least in its earliest and most influential phase, was a man named Demetrius of Phalerum. Demetrius had an unusual resume even by the standards of a period full of unusual resumes. He had once governed Athens itself, serving for roughly a decade as a kind of philosopher-administrator installed by the Macedonian regime that controlled the city after Alexander's death. He had studied under Aristotle's successor, Theophrastus, at the Lyceum, the school Aristotle had founded in Athens, which meant he came to Alexandria already steeped in exactly the kind of comprehensive, encyclopedic approach to knowledge that Aristotle had pioneered. Aristotle's own private library and his habit of systematically collecting, cataloguing, and cross-referencing texts on every subject from biology to poetry to politics is often cited by historians as the direct conceptual ancestor of what Alexandria would eventually become. When Demetrius fell from power in Athens after a shift in the political winds, he found refuge at the Ptolemaic court, and he brought with him both the Aristotelian model of organized scholarship and a clear vision of how a king might use it. Demetrius is credited by several ancient sources with first proposing to Ptolemy that Alexandria should establish an institution dedicated to gathering, in one place, copies of every significant text in the Greek-speaking world. Not simply a library in the sense we might casually use the word today, a quiet room of shelved scrolls for private reading, but something closer to a comprehensive research institute, a place where the texts themselves were only the raw material, and the actual purpose was the production of new scholarship from that material. The Greek term used for this broader institution, the Mausian, gives us our modern word museum, but it meant something closer to a shrine to the Muses, the 9 goddesses the Greeks associated with poetry, history, astronomy, and every other branch of the arts and sciences. The Mausian of Alexandria was conceived as a kind of temple to organized knowledge itself, complete with covered walkways for contemplative walking, a dining hall where scholars ate together at royal expense, lecture halls, and, at its heart, the library that held the texts everyone needed. The actual founding likely happened under Ptolemy I, sometimes called Ptolemy Sota, meaning Ptolemy the Saviour, though the institution reached its full and most celebrated form under his son, Ptolemy II, known as Ptolemy Philadelphus. The transition between these two reigns in the early decades of the 3rd century BC is when the project moved from an ambitious idea to an operating reality, with buildings, staff, and an aggressive acquisitions policy that ancient writers describe with a mixture of admiration and faint scandal. The acquisitions policy is one of the most genuinely fascinating parts of this entire story, because it reveals something important about how the Ptolemies actually thought about knowledge. They did not wait passively for scholars to donate texts out of civic generosity. They pursued books the way other kings pursued territory or tribute, with state resources, royal decree, and on at least some documented occasions, methods that ranged from aggressive purchasing to outright confiscation. One often repeated story, preserved by later writers and probably exaggerated in its details but almost certainly true in its general spirit, describes a royal decree requiring that any ship docking in Alexandria's harbour submit any books aboard for copying. The crew would receive a copy back, made by the library's scribes, while the original was retained for the royal collection. Whether this happened exactly as described, or whether it is a later simplification of a messier reality, it captures something true about the city's relationship to texts. Alexandria did not simply collect books, it treated the written knowledge passing through its harbour as a resource belonging, in some meaningful sense, to the state, the same way Egypt's grain or its access to incense roots belonged to the state. Another story, this one concerning the city of Athens specifically, describes the Ptolemaic court borrowing the official Athenian state copies of the great tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, by offering a substantial cash deposit as security for their safe return, and then simply choosing to forfeit the deposit rather than give the original texts back, sending Athens a set of copies instead, and keeping the originals in Alexandria. If true, and ancient sources differ on the exact details, it is a small story that says something large about the relative weight Alexandria placed on possessing the most authoritative texts versus the social cost of mildly offending a city that, by this point in history, was a faded power compared to its classical glory days. Alexandria wanted the originals. Alexandria generally got what it wanted, beyond purchasing and copying and the occasional act of diplomatic sleight of hand. The library also actively recruited the era's leading scholars to come live and work in Alexandria, offering salaries, housing, meals in the common dining hall, and freedom from the ordinary economic pressures that might otherwise force a brilliant mathematician or poet to spend their days teaching wealthy children's sons instead of pursuing original research. This was, in effect, one of history's earliest and most successful models of state-funded research, and it worked extraordinarily well because it attracted precisely the kind of ambitious, talented people who wanted to spend their lives thinking rather than merely surviving, and who recognized that nowhere else in the world offered quite this combination of resources, colleagues, and royal prestige attached to their work. The scale of the resulting collection, as described by ancient sources writing in later centuries, is almost certainly exaggerated in its precise numbers. The way ancient population figures and army sizes tend to be exaggerated, but even allowing generously for inflation, the underlying reality was still extraordinary for its time. Figures cited by various ancient authors range from roughly 200,000 scrolls in earlier estimates to numbers approaching 700,000 in later and more enthusiastic accounts. Modern historians treat these specific numbers with real skepticism, partly because ancient writers loved a big round number, and partly because a single literary work like Homer's Iliad would itself have required multiple scrolls to contain, meaning scroll counts and actual distinct titles are not the same measurement at all. But even a conservative reading of the evidence suggests that Alexandria, within a few generations of its founding, held more written material in one location than any other institution in the ancient Mediterranean world, by a significant margin, and quite possibly more than existed in any other single place anywhere on Earth at that time. What exactly did the library physically consist of? Here, the historical record becomes frustratingly thin, because nobody who wrote a detailed architectural description of the library has had their work survive to the present day, and archaeology has not been able to definitively locate and excavate the site, partly because parts of ancient Alexandria's royal quarter now lie underwater in the harbour, submerged by earthquakes and subsidence over the centuries, and partly because the modern city of Alexandria has been continuously built and rebuilt directly on top of the ancient one for 2,000 years. making large-scale excavation of the relevant area practically difficult. What we know comes from scattered references in ancient authors who mention the library in passing while writing about something else entirely, supplemented by educated reconstruction based on the general architectural conventions of the period. The most commonly cited reconstruction places the library as part of the royal palace complex, in the district known as the Bruchion, near the harbour, with the Mauchion as the broader institutional umbrella, and the library itself as one component within it, likely including a peripatos, a covered walkway suitable for philosophical conversation while walking, a communal exedra, or seating area for lectures and discussions, individual studies or alcoves for scholars working on specific projects, and of course the storage areas for the scrolls themselves, likely arranged in numbered pigeonhole compartments along the walls, organized by subject and author according to a cataloguing system that, as we will see, was itself one of the library's most significant intellectual achievements. There may also have been a secondary, smaller collection housed at the Serapeum, a temple to the god Serapis elsewhere in the city, which some ancient sources describe as a kind of daughter library, intended either to handle overflow from the main collection or to serve a different scholarly community, possibly with different conditions for public access than the more restricted Royal Mauchion. The exact relationship between these two collections, and whether the Serapeum Library was truly a branch of the same institution or something more independent, remains one of the genuine open questions that scholars continue to debate, precisely because so little direct evidence survives. What is much better documented, because it comes up repeatedly in the biographical and scholarly traditions surrounding specific individuals, is who worked there and what they actually did with all of this gathered material. And this, more than the scroll counts or the architectural layout, is where the story of Alexandria becomes genuinely remarkable, because the people who passed through its halls over the following several centuries did not simply read what had already been written. They transformed entire fields of human knowledge in ways that still shape how we think today, more than 2,000 years later, often without anyone outside of specialist academic circles realizing where those ideas originally came from. The institution had, over the course of its history, a succession of chief librarians, men who held the formal title of head of the library, and who in several documented cases were themselves among the most significant intellectual figures of their generation, rather than simply administrators managing other people's work. The first of these was Zenodotus of Ephesus, who took on the role sometime in the early 3rd century BC, and whose primary contribution was one that sounds almost mundane stated plainly, but was in fact foundational to everything that came afterward. Zenodotus produced the first systematic critical edition of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. This requires a moment of context to appreciate properly. By the time Alexandria existed, Homer's poems had already been circulating for roughly 4 centuries, copied and recopied by hand across the Greek world, performed aloud by professional reciters who sometimes improvised or adjusted lines, and gradually accumulating the kind of textual variation that inevitably happens when a long poem is transmitted without a centralized authority, checking each copy against some agreed standard. Different cities had their own slightly different versions. Lines had been added. In some cases, entire passages had been inserted by performers wanting to flatter a local audience by inserting a heroic ancestor into the story. And the text that any given Greek reader encountered depended heavily on which regional copying tradition had produced their particular scroll. Zenodotus, working with access to multiple regional versions gathered through Alexandria's aggressive acquisitions, set about comparing them systematically, identifying lines he believed were later insertions, marking passages he considered suspicious or corrupted, and producing what he considered the most authoritative possible text. He used editorial marks in the margins, a horizontal line called an obellos to flag lines he suspected were spurious, establishing a tradition of textual criticism, the careful comparative, evidence-based reconstruction of an authoritative text from multiple imperfect copies that did not really exist in any rigorous form before this work and that remains, in its basic methodology, recognizable to modern classical scholars and biblical textual critics today. Every time a modern editor compares manuscripts to determine what an ancient author actually wrote, they are working in a tradition that traces directly back to the scroll rooms of Alexandria. Zenodotus's work was not perfect, and we know this because his successors in the role spent considerable energy improving on it. The second major librarian, or possibly the second after a brief gap, was Apollonius of Rhodes, who is remembered today less for library administration and more for his own epic poem, the Argonautica, which told the story of Jason and the Argonauts in a self-consciously literary, elusive style very different from Homer's oral tradition roots, drawing explicitly on the scholarly bookish culture of Alexandria itself. It is one of the most interesting features of the library's intellectual culture that its chief administrators were frequently also its most accomplished working poets and scholars, meaning the institution did not separate the curating of old knowledge from the production of new creative and intellectual work. The same people did both, constantly moving between the role of editor and the role of original author. The third major librarian, and arguably the single most important intellectual figure in the entire history of the institution, was Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who took on the role in the latter part of the 3rd century BC and held it for roughly 4 decades. Eratosthenes is one of those historical figures whose actual range of accomplishment is so wide that it can feel almost implausible when listed out, and yet it is extremely well documented across multiple ancient sources. He was a mathematician, a geographer, an astronomer, a poet, a literary critic, a historian, and a philosopher, and he made significant original contributions in nearly every one of these fields, which is precisely the kind of polymathic range that the Alexandrian model, with its combination of resources, colleagues, and freedom from teaching obligations, was specifically designed to enable. His single most famous achievement, the one that still appears in basic science education today, was his calculation of the circumference of the Earth, performed without leaving Egypt, using nothing more than careful observation, geometry, and the kind of audacious confidence in mathematical reasoning that characterized the best Alexandrian scholarship. The method, as described in later sources summarizing his now-lost original work, relied on a report that in the city of Syene, near modern Aswan in southern Egypt, the sun appeared directly overhead at noon on the summer solstice, casting no shadow at all into a deep well, a detail Eratosthenes seems to have learned from records held in the library itself. He then measured, or had measured, the angle of the shadow cast by a vertical object in Alexandria at the exact same moment on the same day, and used the difference between those two angles, combined with the known distance between the two cities, to calculate the Earth's total circumference through simple proportional geometry. If the angular difference between the two locations was a known fraction of a full circle, and the actual physical distance between the two cities was known, then the full circumference of the Earth could be calculated by simple multiplication. His result, when converted from the ancient unit of measurement he used, called the stadion, into modern terms, comes out remarkably close to the actual circumference of the Earth, with most modern estimates suggesting his answer was within a few % of the correct figure, depending on exactly which length we assume he meant by a stadion, since the ancient world used several different standards under that same name, and we cannot be entirely certain which one Eratosthenes had in mind. Even with that uncertainty, the achievement remains genuinely staggering, not because nobody before him had guessed the Earth was round, since that had been generally accepted among educated Greeks since at least the time of Pythagoras and Aristotle, centuries earlier, but because Eratosthenes did not merely accept roundness as a philosophical proposition. He measured it using data geometry and a method that could in principle be checked and repeated by anyone else with access to the same measurements. This is, in miniature, exactly what made Alexandrian scholarship different from much of what had come before. It was empirical. It treated the natural world as something to be measured rather than merely speculated about, and it treated mathematics as the language in which those measurements could be turned into genuine knowledge rather than mere educated guessing. Eratosthenes did not stop with the Earth's circumference. He produced a comprehensive geographical treatise, now lost but extensively quoted and summarized by later geographers, that attempted to map the entire known world using a coordinate system of parallels and meridians, an approach to cartography that again established conventions still recognizable in how we draw maps today. He calculated the tilt of the Earth's axis with impressive accuracy. He worked on prime number theory in mathematics, devising what is still called the sieve of Eratosthenes, a method for systematically identifying prime numbers by eliminating multiples. That remains a standard teaching tool in introductory mathematics courses to this day, more than 2,000 years after he devised it. He wrote on the history and chronology of Greek literature, attempting to establish reliable dates for events like the Trojan War, based on careful cross-referencing of genealogies and astronomical references, an early and surprisingly rigorous form of historical chronology. He was nicknamed by some of his contemporaries Beta, the Greek letter representing the number 2, supposedly because he was considered excellent in every field he touched, but not quite the single greatest specialist in any one of them individually. A backhanded compliment that, viewed from the distance of 23 centuries, looks considerably more impressive than the people coining it perhaps intended, since being the broadest possible genius rather than the narrowest possible specialist is precisely the kind of intellectual range that the library's structure made possible, and that few other institutions in history have managed to cultivate so successfully. Eratosthenes worked alongside, corresponded with, and was in some cases directly preceded by an extraordinary roster of other scholars whose individual achievements considered together make the case for Alexandria's centrality to the history of human knowledge almost without need for further argument. Euclid, whose dates place him in Alexandria slightly before Eratosthenes' own tenure, very likely during the reign of the first Ptolemy, compiled and systematized geometry into the form most people still encounter today if they take a basic geometry class anywhere in the world. His work, known as the Elements, took the scattered geometric knowledge that had been developed by earlier Greek mathematicians, including Pythagoras and his followers, and organized it into a single coherent, logically structured system, building up from a small set of explicitly stated axioms and definitions through a sequence of theorems and proofs, each one resting on what had been established before. This structure, the axiomatic method, the idea that you can build an entire field of rigorous knowledge from a small set of self-evident, starting assumptions through pure logical deduction, became the model not just for mathematics, but for how rigorous argument itself would be understood for the next 2,000 years, influencing everyone from medieval theologians, structuring arguments about the existence of God to Isaac Newton, structuring his own physics text, centuries later in explicitly Euclidean form, complete with the same sequence of definitions, axioms, and propositions. There is a famous anecdote, probably apocryphal in its precise details, but illustrative of how later generations remembered Alexandrian scholarly culture, in which Ptolemy I, frustrated by the difficulty of working through Euclid's geometric proofs, asked whether there was an easier way to learn the material, a shortcut available to a busy king that ordinary students did not have. Euclid is supposed to have replied that there is no royal road to geometry, meaning that mathematical truth does not bend for rank or status, that a king must work through the proofs with exactly the same rigor as anyone else if he wants to actually understand them. Whether or not Euclid said precisely this, the story persisted for centuries because it captured something the Alexandrian scholarly community apparently took very seriously, an insistence that the standards of evidence and proof applied uniformly, regardless of who was asking. Archimedes of Syracuse, generally considered among the greatest mathematicians and engineers of the ancient world, was not permanently based in Alexandria, having spent most of his working life in his home city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily. But he studied in Alexandria as a younger man and maintained an active scholarly correspondence with Alexandrian mathematicians for the rest of his career, including with Eratosthenes directly, sending some of his most significant mathematical results to Alexandria in the form of letters explaining his methods, since he valued the judgment of the Alexandrian scholarly community as the most rigorous available audience for his work, even from a considerable distance across the Mediterranean. This connection illustrates something important about how Alexandria functioned, not simply as a single building full of scrolls, but as the organizing hub of an entire network of scholarly communication stretching across the Greek-speaking Mediterranean world, with letters, visiting scholars, and copied texts circulating constantly between Alexandria and other intellectual centers, with Alexandria typically serving as the most prestigious and authoritative node in that network, the place whose approval mattered most, and whose library held the reference copies against which other versions of a text might be checked. In medicine, Alexandria became home to anatomical and physiological research of a kind that simply was not being conducted anywhere else in the contemporary world, for reasons that are uncomfortable to discuss honestly but important to understand. Two physicians associated with Alexandria in the early Ptolemaic period, Herophilus and Erasistratus, are credited by later medical writers, particularly the much later Roman-era physician Galen, with making remarkably accurate observations about human anatomy, including detailed descriptions of the nervous system, distinguishing between motor and sensory nerves, mapping the structure of the brain in more detail than any predecessor, and Herophilus in particular is credited with recognizing the brain, rather than the heart as the seat of thought and intelligence, a conclusion many earlier thinkers, including Aristotle, had explicitly rejected in favor of the heart. The uncomfortable part of this history is that ancient sources, including some hostile later Roman writers, suggest that at least some of this anatomical knowledge came from the dissection, and possibly the vivisection, meaning dissection of living subjects, of condemned criminals provided by the Ptolemaic state for exactly this purpose. Modern historians of medicine treat these specific claims with appropriate caution, since they come primarily from sources writing centuries later, who had their own polemical reasons for portraying Alexandrian medicine in a lurid light, but the broader picture that Ptolemaic Egypt's relatively relaxed religious and ethical constraints around human dissection, compared to many other ancient societies that held strong taboos against cutting open a human body, allowed a level of direct anatomical investigation that simply could not have happened in most other contemporary cultures, is generally accepted, and it represents one of the genuine moral complexities embedded in this story of intellectual achievement. The same political and religious conditions that made spectacular scientific progress possible also, in at least some documented instances, came at a human cost that we should not look away from, simply because it happened a very long time ago. Astronomy at Alexandria, across the several centuries the library remained active, produced a sequence of figures whose work would not be meaningfully surpassed in the Western world until the scientific revolution of the 16 and 1700s, nearly 2 millennia later. Aristarchus of Samos, working in Alexandria in the early 3rd century BC, proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, suggesting that the Earth and other planets orbited the Sun rather than the Sun, and everything else orbiting a stationary Earth, a theory that anticipated Copernicus by roughly 18 centuries. Aristarchus's heliocentric model did not win out over the geocentric or alternative in his own time, for reasons that were not entirely unreasonable given the observational technology available. Since a moving Earth seemed to require an explanation for why we do not feel that motion, and why the stars do not appear to shift position as we travel around the Sun, an effect called stellar parallax that simply could not be detected with the instruments available in the ancient world, because the stars are so unimaginably distant that the effect is too small to see without a telescope. Aristarchus's heliocentric idea was set aside by most subsequent ancient astronomers in favor of an Earth-centered model, one that would eventually be elaborated into its most sophisticated and mathematically detailed form, roughly 4 centuries later, by another Alexandria-based astronomer named Claudius Ptolemy. No relation to the ruling dynasty, despite sharing the name, whose comprehensive astronomical treatise, known by its later Arabic-influenced title as the Almagest, became the standard reference work for predicting the motion of the Sun, Moon, and planets across the sky for the next 1400 years, used by Islamic, Byzantine, and eventually Western European astronomers, right up until the Copernican revolution finally displaced it. It is worth pausing on this particular irony, because it captures something essential about how scientific progress actually works, which is rarely a single straight line of improvement, but often a more complicated story full of dead ends, false starts, and ideas that were correct but premature, lacking the supporting evidence or technology to be properly confirmed and accepted. Aristarchus had the right basic idea about the structure of the solar system, roughly 1800 years before anyone else successfully revived and confirmed it, and his contemporaries had reasonable, evidence-based grounds for doubting him anyway, given what they could actually observe with the naked eye and simple instruments. Alexandria was capable of producing both a startlingly correct intuition far ahead of its time and the far more conservative, mathematically elaborate alternative model that would actually dominate astronomical thinking for the next millennium and a half. Both of these emerged from the same broad intellectual culture, the same library, the same tradition of careful observation and rigorous mathematical modeling, even though they pointed in completely opposite directions about the basic structure of the cosmos. Hipparchus, another major astronomer with strong connections to Alexandrian methods and instruments, even though much of his actual observational work was conducted on the island of Rhodes, is credited with discovering the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble in the Earth's rotational axis that causes the position of the stars relative to the seasons to shift very gradually over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years, an effect so subtle that detecting it at all required comparing his own careful star observations against records compiled by earlier astronomers more than a century before his time. Records that were available to him specifically because institutions like the library at Alexandria had preserved and catalogued that older observational data, rather than letting it be lost or discarded. This points to something genuinely distinctive about what made Alexandria valuable, beyond simply gathering smart people in one building. The library's systematic preservation of older records, going back generations, made certain kinds of long time-scale scientific discovery possible that would have been completely unattainable for any single scholar working only within their own lifetime, no matter how brilliant, Hipparchus could only detect a 26,000-year wobble in the Earth's axis because someone, decades before he was born, had bothered to write down precise star positions, and someone else had bothered to keep that record safe and accessible for over a century afterward. Beyond mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, Alexandria's scholarly community made foundational contributions to mechanical engineering, particularly through the work of Ctesibius, sometimes considered the founder of the entire field of pneumatics, the study of using air and gas pressure to do mechanical work. Sir Ctesibius is credited with significant improvements to the water clock, with inventing or substantially improving the force pump, a device used for moving water under pressure that would remain essentially unimproved in basic design for the better part of 2,000 years afterward, and with early experiments in compressed air mechanisms that later Alexandrian engineers, particularly Philo of Byzantium, and in the much later Roman period, Hero of Alexandria, would build upon to create an entire tradition of automated devices, sometimes purely for practical use, sometimes for what we might now call entertainment or spectacle. Hero of Alexandria, working considerably later than the library's classical golden age, in the early centuries of the Roman imperial period, designed automatic temple doors that appeared to open on their own through a hidden mechanism using heated air and water, a coin-operated machine that dispensed a fixed amount of holy water when a coin was inserted, essentially the world's first vending machine, and most famously a device called the aeolipile, a simple steam-powered rotating sphere that demonstrated the basic principle of using steam pressure to generate rotational motion, a principle that, had the surrounding economic and social conditions of the ancient world been different, could theoretically have led towards something resembling a steam engine many centuries before James Watt's famous improvements in the 1700s. The ancient world never made that leap, for reasons historians still debate, related partly to the widespread availability of slave labor, reducing the economic incentive to mechanize physical work, and partly to the simple fact that Hero's device, while a brilliant proof of concept, was never developed into anything capable of doing useful sustained work at meaningful scale. But the underlying scientific principle was understood, demonstrated, and written down in Alexandria nearly 17 centuries before it would be independently rediscovered, and this time properly industrialized in Britain. Among the most historically consequential projects undertaken at Alexandria, in terms of its lasting influence on world religion and culture, rather than natural science, was the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, a project traditionally known as the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70, referring to a legend that 70, or in some versions 72, Jewish scholars were brought to Alexandria and independently produced translations that miraculously matched each other word for word, confirming the translation's divine accuracy. The actual historical process was almost certainly considerably more mundane and gradual than this legend suggests, likely beginning with a translation of the first 5 books, the Torah, commissioned sometime in the early 3rd century BC, quite possibly under Ptolemy II, with the remaining books of the Hebrew Bible translated over the following century or two by various hands working with varying degrees of skill and consistency. The practical reason behind the project was straightforward and reflects the real demographic reality of ancient Alexandria, which had become home to an enormous and increasingly Greek-speaking Jewish community, descendants of earlier migrations and refugees who had settled in the city in such numbers that an entire quarter of Alexandria was substantially Jewish, and many of these Jewish Alexandrians, by the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, were considerably more comfortable reading and speaking Greek than Hebrew, having been born and raised in a thoroughly Hellenized cultural environment. A Greek translation of their own sacred scriptures was not an act of religious betrayal, but a practical necessity for a community whose primary language had shifted. The significance of this translation for subsequent world history is difficult to overstate. The Septuagint became the version of the Hebrew Scriptures most widely read throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world in the centuries leading up to and following the start of the Common Era. And it was the Septuagint, rather than the original Hebrew text, that the authors of the New Testament most frequently quoted when citing the Hebrew Bible, since the early Christian movement spread primarily among Greek-speaking populations across the Roman world. Many of the specific phrasings and theological concepts that would shape later Christian doctrine were filtered through the specific translation choices made by anonymous Alexandrian Jewish scholars working centuries earlier, choices that sometimes diverged in subtle but theologically significant ways from what the original Hebrew most literally said. A document produced as a practical accommodation for a diaspora community's changing linguistic habits ended up shaping the theological vocabulary of a religion that did not yet exist when the translation began. And that religion would eventually become the dominant faith of an entire civilization. This is, in miniature, exactly the kind of indirect, unpredictable, centuries-delayed influence that makes Alexandria's intellectual legacy so much larger and stranger than a simple list of famous scientists can fully capture. The library's internal organizational methods, while less dramatic than calculating the Earth's circumference or translating sacred texts, deserve their own attention because they represent a genuinely original intellectual achievement in their own right, one whose basic logic underlies every library and every database that has existed since. With a collection running into the hundreds of thousands of scrolls, simply finding a specific text, or even knowing what texts existed on a given subject, was itself a massive intellectual challenge requiring its own systematic solution. Callimachus of Cyrene, a poet and scholar who worked at the library, likely without ever holding the official title of chief librarian himself, though sources differ on this point, is credited with producing the Pinakes, a comprehensive bibliographic catalogue of the library's holdings, organized by subject and including biographical information about each author, along with lists of their known works. This catalogue, running across multiple scrolls in its own right, given the scale of the collection it described, represents one of the earliest known examples of systematic bibliography in human history. The deliberate, organized attempt to create a reference tool describing not the content of a single text, but the entire landscape of available text on a subject, complete with author attribution and basic biographical context. Every modern library catalogue, every academic bibliography, every database that lets you search by author or subject heading is operating on a conceptual model whose first large-scale, systematic implementation we can trace directly back to Callimachus, working in the scroll rooms of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. This cataloguing work intersected directly with one of the thornier scholarly problems the library's staff faced constantly, which was the question of authenticity and attribution. In a world without printing presses, without standardized publishing, and without any centralized registry of authorship, it was disturbingly easy for texts to circulate under the wrong author's name, either through honest confusion over the centuries, through a later writer's desire to lend their own work additional prestige by attaching a famous name to it, or through simple commercial fraud, since a scroll falsely attributed to a famous philosopher could often be sold for considerably more than the same content attributed honestly to an unknown author. Alexandrian scholars developed increasingly sophisticated methods for evaluating these questions of authenticity, comparing vocabulary, style, historical references, and internal consistency across a writer's accepted body of work to judge whether a disputed text plausibly belonged to that same hand. an early and remarkably systematic form of the same stylometric and source-critical methods that modern scholars still use today when trying to determine, for instance, whether a particular New Testament letter was genuinely written by the Apostle Paul or by a later author writing in his name, or whether particular passages within a single ancient text show signs of having been written by more than one author across different periods. The basic intellectual toolkit for asking these questions and for taking the answers seriously as a matter of evidence rather than mere assumption or tradition was substantially developed and refined within the scroll rooms of the Alexandrian library by scholars whose individual names have mostly been lost to us, working through problems of attribution and authenticity that remain genuinely live questions in textual scholarship even now, more than 2,000 years later. It is worth stepping back from the individual achievements for a moment to imagine what daily life actually looked like for the scholars who lived and worked within this institution. Because the texture of that life tells us something important about why Alexandria succeeded so spectacularly where other ambitious royal projects throughout history have failed to produce comparable results. A scholar invited to join the Mausion received what amounted to a royal stipend, a salary paid directly from the Ptolemaic treasury, along with free housing within or near the palace complex and the right to take meals at the common dining hall alongside fellow scholars, an arrangement ancient sources describe with a mixture of genuine admiration and occasional satire, since a guaranteed income and free food provided by royal generosity, with no specific deliverable required on any fixed schedule, inevitably attracted not only brilliant original thinkers, but also, according to some surviving comic and satirical references from the period, a fair number of scholars who were rather better at maintaining their position through court politics and clever argumentation than at producing genuinely original work. The Greek comic poet Timon of Phlius, in a passage that survives only as a brief quotation in a later source, mocked the Mausion's scholars as overfed birds squabbling endlessly in their cage, a barbed but not entirely unfair description of what happens when you gather a large number of intellectually competitive people together with guaranteed resources and considerable free time, conditions which produce both extraordinary creative output and, apparently, no small amount of academic infighting. An observation that anyone who has spent time around any modern university faculty might find uncomfortably familiar even after more than 2,000 years. This points to something genuinely important about how we should understand the institution as a whole, which is that it was never some pristine, idealized temple of pure disinterested scholarship floating above ordinary human concerns. It was, like every human institution that has ever existed, embedded within a real political context, dependent on royal patronage that could be generous or stingy, depending on the personality and priorities of whichever Ptolemy currently held the throne, subject to the ordinary jealousies and rivalries that emerge whenever ambitious people compete for prestige and position, and shaped by the specific interests of the dynasty that funded it. The Ptolemies did not fund the library purely out of disinterested love of knowledge for its own sake. However much individual kings may have genuinely shared that sentiment, they funded it because a magnificent library, staffed by the most celebrated scholars of the age, was an extraordinarily effective form of soft power and royal legitimacy, a way for a relatively new dynasty of Macedonian Greek origin, ruling over Egypt as foreign conquerors only a generation or two removed from Alexander's original invasion, to establish themselves as the rightful, glorious heirs and stewards of the entire Hellenic cultural tradition, more thoroughly Greek than Greece itself, more devoted to Homer and philosophy and mathematics than Athens had managed to be in the centuries since its own classical golden age had faded. A king who could boast that the greatest living mathematicians, poets, and astronomers all worked under his personal patronage, gathered in his own capital, was making an extremely effective argument for his own legitimacy and prestige on the international stage, one that mattered enormously in a competitive world of rival Hellenistic kingdoms, the Seleucids ruling much of the former Persian territory to the east, the Antigonids in Macedonia itself, and various smaller kingdoms scattered across Asia Minor and the Aegean, all of whom were engaged in their own constant competition for prestiged territory and the loyalty of the broader Greek-speaking world. This political dimension also explains some of the institution's vulnerabilities, which would matter a great deal later in this story. An institution dependent on royal generosity is, by definition, an institution vulnerable to royal neglect, royal financial crisis, or simple royal indifference, and the long history of the Ptolemaic dynasty, across nearly 3 centuries of rule, includes plenty of all three. The earliest Ptolemies, particularly the first 3 or 4 generations of the dynasty, are generally remembered by ancient sources as energetic, intellectually engaged patrons who took genuine personal interest in the scholarly community they had assembled. Ptolemy II in particular is credited not only with substantially expanding the library's collection, but with personal involvement in some of its scholarly debates. And ancient sources describe him corresponding directly with scholars, asking after their work, and treating the Mausians members with a degree of personal attention that suggests real intellectual curiosity rather than mere political calculation. But the dynasty did not remain uniformly stable or uniformly generous across its full 300-year span. Later Ptolemies, particularly from the 2nd century BC onward, increasingly faced succession crises, civil wars between rival siblings, devastating popular uprisings within Egypt itself, and growing political and financial pressure from an increasingly assertive Roman Republic looking hungrily at Egypt's wealth from across the Mediterranean. A royal court consumed by these crises had correspondingly less attention, and often less money, to spare for scholarly patronage, and the library's fortunes across these later centuries seem to have waxed and waned considerably, depending on exactly how stable and how wealthy the ruling Ptolemy of any given decade happened to be. One particularly telling and frequently cited episode concerns Ptolemy VIII, sometimes called Ptolemy Physcon, who ruled in the latter part of the 2nd century BC, during a period of intense and often violent dynastic infighting. According to several ancient sources, Ptolemy VIII, during one of the periodic political purges that accompanied his repeated seizures and losses of power, expelled a significant number of scholars from Alexandria, scattering members of the Mausians' intellectual community to other cities across the eastern Mediterranean. This event, whatever its precise scale and motivations, which ancient sources describe with varying levels of detail and reliability, is sometimes cited by modern historians as a meaningful turning point, a moment when Alexandria's scholarly monopoly began to erode, as displaced scholars carried Alexandrian methods, training, and in some cases physical copies of texts to other cities, helping to seed rival centers of learning, including notably the library at Pergamon in Asia Minor, a kingdom whose rulers had been deliberately building their own rival collection for generations, specifically in competition with Alexandria's prestige. In a rivalry ancient sources describe as having grown intense enough that the Ptolemies allegedly banned the export of papyrus to Pergamon at one point in an attempt to choke off their rivals' ability to keep producing books, a restriction that, according to a story preserved by the later Roman writer Pliny the Elder, prompted Pergamon's scholars to develop an improved method of treating animal skins for writing, producing what became known as parchment, a writing material that would eventually prove more durable than papyrus and would become the dominant medium for books throughout the European Middle Ages, meaning that even Alexandria's occasional acts of petty institutional rivalry ended up indirectly shaping the entire future of book production for the next 1,000 years, in ways nobody involved in the original dispute could possibly have anticipated. Beyond the walls of the Maushan itself, the broader city of Alexandria, in which all of this scholarly activity took place, deserves its own moment of attention, because the library did not exist in isolation from its surroundings. And understanding the city helps explain why this particular place, rather than Athens or Rome or any other ancient city, became the specific setting for this unprecedented concentration of knowledge. Alexandria, within a few generations of its founding, had grown into one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the entire ancient world, with a population that ancient estimates place at several 100,000 people, possibly exceeding 500,000 at its height, a genuinely enormous figure by ancient standards, rivaled in the broader Mediterranean world only by Rome itself in the later centuries of antiquity. The city's wealth came from its position as the primary export hub for Egyptian grain, which fed not only the local population but, in later centuries under Roman rule, a substantial portion of the city of Rome's own population as well, supplemented by Alexandria's role as a transit point for luxury trade goods flowing from further south and east, including incense, spices, and exotic goods arriving via Red Sea ports and then travelling overland or via canal to the Mediterranean coast. The most famous physical landmark of the ancient city, after the library itself, was the Lighthouse of Alexandria, sometimes called the Pharos after the island on which it stood, a structure that ancient sources describe as standing somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 feet tall, an almost unimaginable height for any structure of its era apart from the much older Egyptian pyramids, making it, by most ancient reckonings, the tallest man-made structure in the world apart from those much older monuments. The Pharos used a combination of mirrors and, according to most ancient descriptions, an open fire kept burning at its summit to project light visible to ships at a remarkable distance out at sea, serving both as a practical navigational aid guiding vessels safely into Alexandria's sometimes treacherous harbour entrance, and as an unmistakable symbol of the city's wealth, ambition, and technical sophistication, visible from far enough away that it served as the very first impression any traveller arriving by sea would receive of the city they were about to enter. The structure became so famous throughout the ancient and later medieval world that the very word for lighthouse, in several Romance languages, including the French fair and the Italian and Spanish faro, derives directly from the name of this single specific structure, meaning that an enormous number of people across multiple later centuries and multiple later languages have unknowingly been naming an entire category of maritime structure after one particular building in ancient Alexandria, every single time they use that word, without most of them ever realizing the connection. Alexandria's population was famously and unusually diverse for its era, even by the generally cosmopolitan standards of major Mediterranean port cities. The ruling class and much of the educated elite were ethnically Greek or Macedonian, descendants of the soldiers, administrators, and settlers who had arrived with or shortly after Alexander's conquest, and Greek remained the dominant language of government, commerce, and scholarship throughout the entire Ptolemaic period, and well into the subsequent centuries of Roman rule. But the city also contained an enormous native Egyptian population, whose own much older religious, artistic, and intellectual traditions centered on temples and priestly schools that had been operating in Egypt for literally thousands of years before Alexander ever arrived, continued alongside and occasionally intersected with the newer Greek scholarly culture of the Maushan, sometimes in productive exchange and sometimes with considerable mutual suspicion and limited genuine engagement. The substantial Jewish population, whose translation of their scriptures into Greek we have already discussed, formed its own distinct and influential community within the city, with its own neighborhoods, its own internal governance structures, and eventually its own significant tensions with the city's Greek population, tensions that would periodically erupt into serious civil violence across the following centuries, including some genuinely brutal episodes of intercommunal conflict under later Roman rule that foreshadow, in uncomfortable ways, patterns of urban ethnic and religious violence that would recur in various forms throughout much of subsequent human history. Add to this mixture merchants, sailors, and travelers passing through from across the entire eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea trade routes, and Alexandria becomes recognizable as something we might describe, in distinctly modern terms, a genuinely cosmopolitan, multilingual, multi-ethnic metropolis, where the scholarly achievements of the Maurtian represented only one thread, albeit an unusually famous and historically consequential one, within a much larger and more complicated urban fabric. Now we arrive at the part of this story that most people who have heard anything at all about the Library of Alexandria already think they know, the burning. And it is worth saying clearly, right at the outset of this section, that the popular version of this story, the single dramatic fire that destroyed an entire civilization's accumulated knowledge in one terrible night, is almost certainly not what actually happened, or at least not the whole of what happened. The real history is messier, more gradual, more contested among historians, and in some ways more genuinely tragic, precisely because it lacks a single clean villain and a single clean moment of loss. Instead, what the evidence suggests is a long, slow process of decline, punctuated by several distinct destructive episodes spread across roughly 7 centuries, each one chipping away at the collection and the institution surrounding it, until by the time later, writers looked back and tried to explain what had happened to this once legendary library, they reached for whichever single dramatic event seemed to best explain the loss, even when the reality had been considerably more drawn out and complicated. The first major destructive episode we have decent evidence for occurred in 48 BC, and it involves perhaps the single most famous Roman in all of history, Julius Caesar. By this point, roughly 2.5 centuries after the library's founding, Egypt's political independence was rapidly eroding under the weight of Roman power, which had grown to dominate the entire Mediterranean world over the preceding century, leaving the Ptolemaic kingdom as one of the last nominally independent Hellenistic states, surviving largely because successive Ptolemies had become adept at playing various Roman political factions against each other, offering financial support, diplomatic flattery, and occasionally military assistance to whichever Roman general or faction seemed most likely to protect their continued rule. Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his Roman political and military rival Pompey, who had fled there seeking refuge after losing a decisive battle in their ongoing civil war, only for Pompey to be assassinated by agents of the Egyptian court shortly before Caesar's arrival, an act intended to curry favour with Caesar, but one that, according to several ancient accounts, actually disgusted and offended him, since even bitter Roman political enemies generally observed certain expectations about how a defeated rival of Pompey's stature deserved to be treated. Caesar, finding himself effectively trapped in Alexandria, drawn into the complicated internal politics of the Ptolemaic court, including the famous power struggle between the young Cleopatra VII and her brother and co-ruler Ptolemy XIII, ended up engaged in actual military combat within the city itself. A conflict historians refer to as the Alexandrian War, fought between Caesar's relatively small Roman force and the considerably larger Egyptian forces loyal to the young king's faction. At some point during this fighting, according to several ancient sources, Caesar ordered ships in Alexandria's harbour set on fire, apparently as a tactical measure, either to deny those vessels to his Egyptian opponents, or to create a defensive barrier, and this fire, according to at least some accounts, spread from the harbour area into parts of the city itself, including, according to the most explicit ancient claims, buildings associated with the library. Here is where the historical evidence becomes genuinely difficult to pin down with confidence. And it is worth being honest about that difficulty, rather than simply repeating the most dramatic version of events as though it were settled fact. The ancient sources that mention this fire damaging the library are not contemporary eyewitness accounts. They are written considerably later, in some cases more than a century after the events they describe. The Roman geographer and historian Strabo, who actually visited Alexandria himself and wrote about the city's library directly, did so roughly 25 years after Caesar's fire. And Strabo's description of the library and the Maution does not read like a description of an institution that had just been catastrophically destroyed, suggesting that whatever damage occurred in 48 BC, it did not eliminate the institution entirely or even necessarily devastate its core collection. Later writers, including the biographer Plutarch writing well over a century afterward, and the historian Aulus Gellius, and later still the historian Cassius Dio, and the 5th century Christian writer Orosius, do describe the fire as having destroyed a substantial portion of the library's holdings, with some explicitly stating that the great library itself burned during this episode. The most commonly cited figure, appearing in some later sources, suggests something in the range of 40,000 or even 400,000 scrolls were destroyed, numbers that vary wildly between different ancient authors in a way that itself suggests considerable uncertainty and possibly exaggeration in the later retelling. Modern historians, weighing all of this conflicting and chronologically distant evidence, have reached a range of conclusions, but a reasonably common interpretation goes something like this. Caesar's fire in 48 BC very likely did destroy some books, quite possibly a significant number, but the destruction was probably concentrated in warehouses or storage facilities near the harbour, possibly containing scrolls intended for export or recently acquired material, not yet incorporated into the main collection, rather than obliterating the entire central library and Maution complex itself, which appears to have continued operating, based on Strabo's later eyewitness account and other evidence of continued scholarly activity in Alexandria well into the Roman imperial period that followed. This interpretation allows us to hold two things as simultaneously true that might otherwise seem contradictory: that Caesar's fire was a real and meaningful loss of books, and possibly an irreplaceable one, for whatever specific text happened to be in those particular storage facilities, while also recognizing that the library as an institution survived this event and continued functioning for centuries afterward, meaning the popular image of Caesar single-handedly destroying the entire library in one stroke is almost certainly an oversimplification that later writers, working with incomplete information and a natural attraction to dramatic, single-cause narratives, gradually built up into something larger and more total than what the contemporary evidence actually supports. It is also worth noting, because it complicates the standard hero and villain framing many people bring to this story, that Caesar himself, whatever damage his own military actions caused, is also credited by some ancient sources with planning to restore and even expand Alexandria's library afterward. As part of a broader set of ambitious public works, projects he was reportedly considering in his final years before his assassination in 44 BC, cut those plans short, meaning the same man sometimes blamed for the library's destruction may also have intended, whether from genuine appreciation for the institution or simple political calculation about how such a gesture would be received, to become one of its great restorers, a plan that never came to fruition simply because he did not live long enough to carry it out. the library's fortunes through the subsequent Roman imperial period. After Egypt's final absorption into the Roman state following the defeat of Cleopatra and her Roman ally and lover Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, present a picture of gradual, uneven decline rather than any single further catastrophic event, at least for the first couple of centuries of Roman rule. Strabo's eyewitness account, written in the very early years of Roman control over Egypt, describes the Maution as still functioning, with covered walkways, a communal dining hall for scholars, and an active scholarly community, suggesting the institution had survived Caesar's fire and the subsequent political upheavals of the late Republic in reasonably intact form. Roman emperors across the following century or so generally continued some degree of patronage toward Alexandrian scholarship, partly because Roman elite culture had thoroughly absorbed Greek intellectual prestige as a marker of sophistication, and an emperor who supported Alexandrian learning was, in a smaller way, making the same kind of legitimacy claim the early Ptolemies had once made, positioning himself as a worthy patron and protector of the most prestigious intellectual tradition in the Mediterranean world. But the institution under Roman rule was never quite restored to the singular, unrivaled prestige it had enjoyed under the most generous of the early Ptolemies, for several converging reasons. Roman administrative priorities for Egypt were focused overwhelmingly on extracting the province's enormous agricultural wealth as efficiently as possible to feed the city of Rome itself, treating Egypt essentially as the Roman world's breadbasket, rather than primarily as an intellectual capital deserving lavish cultural patronage for its own sake. The competitive dynamic that had once driven the Ptolemies to spend extravagantly on scholarly prestige largely disappeared, once Egypt was simply one province within a much larger Roman Empire rather than an independent kingdom competing for status against rival Hellenistic states. And the broader centre of gravity for elite intellectual life across the Mediterranean world was gradually shifting, over the following several centuries, away from any single dominant city and toward a more genuinely multipolar landscape, with rival centres of learning continuing to develop in cities like Athens, Antioch, Pergamon, and eventually, as Christianity grew in influence, a wholly new structure of learning increasingly centred around major Christian centres, including significantly Alexandria itself, but in service of a radically different intellectual project than the one the Ptolemies had originally envisioned. The second major destructive episode in this story, and arguably the one with the clearest documentary evidence and the most genuinely dramatic and well-attested historical narrative attached to it, occurred roughly 4.5 centuries after Caesar's fire, in the year 391 of the Common Era, and it involves not the original Maution library, which by this point seems to have already declined considerably or possibly ceased to exist as a distinct institution, but rather the daughter library housed at the Serapeum, the great temple complex dedicated to the god Serapis that we mentioned earlier, which by the 4th century had apparently become Alexandria's primary remaining repository of pagan scholarly texts, and which stood at the centre of one of the most consequential and disturbing episodes of religious violence in the entire history of late antiquity. To understand what happened at the Serapeum, we need to understand the broader transformation that had swept across the Roman world over the preceding century, a transformation as significant in its own way as anything that had happened at the founding of Alexandria itself. Christianity, which had begun as a small, often persecuted sect within the Roman Empire, had grown dramatically in numbers and influence across the 3rd and 4th centuries, culminating in the Emperor Constantine's conversion and patronage in the early 4th century. And then, by the time we reach the reign of Emperor Theodosius I, in the latter part of that same century, Christianity had moved from being merely tolerated to being established as the empire's official state religion, with traditional pagan worship increasingly restricted, then actively suppressed, through a series of imperial edicts issued in the 380s and early 390s that banned pagan sacrifices, closed pagan temples, and gradually criminalized the practice of the old polytheistic religious traditions that had structured Mediterranean spiritual life for well over 1,000 years before Christianity's rise. Alexandria, with its long tradition of religious diversity and its prominent population of educated pagans still devoted to the old gods, became one of the major flashpoints for the resulting tension between the old religious order and the new Christian establishment. The city's Christian bishop in the early 390s was a man named Theophilus, an energetic and, by most ancient accounts, fairly ruthless ecclesiastical politician who used his position to aggressively expand Christian institutional power within the city, often through methods that involved direct confrontation with, and sometimes outright destruction of, pagan religious sites. The specific spark that led to the Serapeum's destruction, according to the most detailed ancient account, written by the church historian Sozomen, along with corroborating if less detailed accounts from other contemporary and near-contemporary writers including Rufinus and the pagan historian Eunapius, involved a dispute over an abandoned pagan temple that Theophilus wanted converted into a Christian church, a renovation project during which workers reportedly discovered and displayed certain pagan religious objects in a manner that the city's remaining pagan population found deeply offensive and sacrilegious, triggering riots between Christian and pagan factions within the city, as tensions escalated into open street violence, with casualty reported on both sides. The city's pagan population, including a number of philosophers and scholars associated with the intellectual traditions still housed at the Serapeum, retreated into the temple complex itself, which was a massive, heavily fortified structure perched on an artificial hill, and attempted to hold it as a defensible position, hoping to negotiate some kind of settlement that would preserve their religious freedom and protect the temple from destruction. Theophilus, rather than negotiating, secured explicit authorization from Emperor Theodosius to destroy the temple entirely, and Christian forces, reportedly including both organized troops and a substantial mob of enthusiastic local Christian believers, stormed and demolished the Serapeum, an event ancient sources describe in considerable and sometimes triumphant detail, since several of the surviving accounts were written by Christian historians who viewed the temple's destruction not as a tragedy but as a righteous and celebrated victory over paganism, the final symbolic triumph of the true faith over the old false gods, expressed in language that leaves no doubt about how thoroughly the writer's sympathies lay with the destroyers rather than with anything that was lost. This is genuinely one of the more uncomfortable aspects of this entire story to sit with, honestly, because it forces a recognition that the people who tore down the Serapeum, and by extension whatever scholarly texts and collections it still housed at that point, were not portrayed by their own contemporaries as villains or vandals at all. They were celebrated by writers sympathetic to their cause as righteous agents of religious truth, overcoming idolatrous error, and that celebratory framing tells us something important about how much the loss of ancient pagan scholarship was, or was not, mourned by the dominant cultural and religious authorities of the time. The very same intellectual world that had once prized the careful, comparative, evidence-based scholarship of figures like Zenodotus and Eratosthenes had, by the late 4th century, become subordinate to a new set of priorities in which a temple's pagan religious associations mattered considerably more than whatever scholarly resources happened to be stored within its walls, and the destruction of those resources, if indeed substantial scholarly material was still housed there at this point, which remains genuinely debated among historians, given how unclear the surviving sources are about exactly what the Serapeum's library still contained by the 390s, was treated as an acceptable, even admirable, cost of religious and ideological triumph. It is important to note, in fairness to the historical complexity here, that modern historians genuinely disagree about how much of a functioning scholarly library actually still existed at the Serapeum by 391, as opposed to the building primarily serving, by that point, as a religious temple complex with some smaller residual collection of texts, rather than anything resembling the grand scholarly institution of the early Ptolemaic centuries. Some scholars argue the Serapeum's destruction has been somewhat over-dramatized in popular retellings of the Alexandria story, since the truly catastrophic loss of the Great Library's core holdings. If such a single catastrophic loss ever really happened at all, rather than a more gradual erosion, more likely occurred earlier, whether through Caesar's fire, through subsequent neglect, or through a slow scattering and decay of materials across the 3rd century, a turbulent period of Roman civil wars, plague, and economic crisis, sometimes called the crisis of the 3rd century, during which Alexandria itself suffered serious civil violence and was even besieged and partially destroyed by Roman imperial forces under Emperor Aurelian in the early 270s, an episode that receives far less popular attention than either Caesar's fire or the Serapeum's destruction, but that several modern historians consider potentially just as significant, if not more so, in terms of actual physical damage done to the city's scholarly institutions and collections, simply because it has not generated the same kind of dramatic, well-documented ancient narrative that later writers found compelling enough to repeat and elaborate upon. Whatever the precise scale of what was lost specifically at the Serapeum in 391, the broader trajectory of Alexandria's scholarly culture across the following decades continued along an increasingly difficult and, in at least one case, genuinely horrifying path. One that brings us to the story of Hypatia, probably the single most famous individual scholar associated with the later period of Alexandrian intellectual life, and certainly the most tragic. Hypatia was a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher, working in Alexandria in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the daughter of another mathematician named Theon, who had himself been associated with what remained of the Mausian tradition, producing commentaries on earlier mathematical works, including those of Euclid and Ptolemy the astronomer. Hypatia herself taught philosophy, primarily in the Neoplatonic tradition, that had become the dominant philosophical school of late antiquity, attracting students from across the social and religious spectrum of Alexandria, including, significantly, both pagan and Christian students, since philosophical education at this level of sophistication had not yet become entirely segregated along strict religious lines, and Hypatia's reputation for learning, eloquence, and personal integrity was such that she was respected across these lines in a way that increasingly few other prominent figures of her era managed to achieve. Several of her students went on to hold significant positions within the Christian church itself, including one, Synesius of Cyrene, who became a bishop and who wrote letters to Hypatia expressing genuine personal affection and continued intellectual respect for his former teacher. Letters that survive and that give us some of our most direct evidence for what kind of person and what kind of teacher Hypatia actually was, beyond the more dramatic and politically charged accounts of her eventual death. That death came in the year 415, in circumstances that reflect, in concentrated and brutal form, exactly the kind of political and religious tensions that had already destroyed the Serapeum a generation earlier. Hypatia had cultivated a close working relationship with Orestes, the Roman prefect governing Alexandria, a relationship that put her in the middle of an escalating and increasingly violent power struggle between Orestes, representing secular Roman imperial administration, and Cyril, the city's Christian bishop, who, like his predecessor Theophilus, was an aggressive and politically formidable ecclesiastical leader determined to expand the church's institutional authority within the city, often in direct competition with secular civic officials. Rumours began circulating, possibly deliberately spread by Cyril's supporters or by other factions hostile to Hypatia, suggesting that her continued influence over Orestes and her general prominence and respect within the city made her somehow responsible for the ongoing conflict between church and civic authority, and that her philosophical teachings, explicitly pagan in their intellectual tradition, even if she personally maintained respectful relationships with Christian students and colleagues, made her a dangerous and corrupting influence that needed to be eliminated. In March of 415, according to the detailed account preserved by the contemporary historian Socrates Scholasticus, a mob, described in the sources as primarily made up of a particularly zealous faction of monks and other Christian partisans loyal to Cyril, seized Hypatia from her carriage as she travelled through the city, dragged her to a church, stripped her and beat her to death with broken pieces of pottery or roofing tiles, before mutilating her body and burning the remains. The killing shocked even many contemporaries, including some within the Christian community itself, and it became almost immediately and certainly across the subsequent centuries as her story was repeatedly retold, one of the most enduring symbols in Western intellectual history of the violent collision between rational philosophical inquiry and religious fanaticism, between an old world of pagan learning and a new world increasingly intolerant of anything that fell outside an increasingly narrow and aggressively enforced religious orthodoxy. It is worth being careful and historically honest here, in a way that the popular retelling of Hypatia's story does not always manage to be, because her death, however genuinely horrifying, was fundamentally an act of specific political and religious violence directed at a particular individual caught in a specific local power struggle, rather than a deliberate, targeted destruction of the library or its remaining collections as such. There is no strong contemporary evidence that her murder was directly accompanied by any further destruction of books or scholarly materials, and the popular modern narrative that sometimes folds her death, together with the burning of the library, into one single climactic event of anti-intellectual violence, is a simplification, even though the underlying connection the popular narrative is gesturing toward, the broader collapse of the social, political, and religious conditions that had once made Alexandria's scholarly culture possible, is genuinely real and well documented across this entire period. Hypatia's death did not burn any scrolls, but it marked with brutal and unmistakable clarity just how dangerous it had become by the early 5th century for a prominent intellectual figure in Alexandria to occupy any kind of contested space between competing factions, religious or political, in a city that had once prided itself on being a haven where Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Jewish scholarship, and eventually Christian theology could all coexist, however imperfectly, within the same urban and intellectual space. There is a third destruction story commonly attached to the Library of Alexandria, one that, of all the versions we have discussed so far, rests on probably the weakest historical foundation, and yet it has become, in certain popular and polemical traditions, the most widely repeated explanation of all for the library's final disappearance. This is the story that attributes the library's destruction to the Arab conquest of Egypt in 642, under the military commander Amr ibn al-As, acting on the supposed orders of the Caliph Omar, the second successor to the Prophet Muhammad, as leader of the rapidly expanding early Islamic state. The story, in its most commonly repeated form, goes something like this. After the Arab forces successfully captured Alexandria, completing the broader Arab conquest of Egypt that had begun a few years earlier, a Christian scholar reportedly approached the conquering general Amr ibn al-As and asked that the city's remaining library, said to still contain a substantial collection of books, be spared. Amr, according to this account, wrote to Caliph Omar in Medina asking for guidance on what to do with the collection, and Omar allegedly replied with a now infamous response, stating that if the books contained material that agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary since the Quran already contained everything needed, and if they contained material that disagreed with the Quran, they were dangerous and should be destroyed, and that on this basis, the entire remaining collection was burned, in some versions of the story used as fuel to heat the city's public baths for a period of months, a detail meant to convey the sheer scale of the material supposedly destroyed. This story, dramatic and quotable as it is, has serious problems as a piece of actual history, and the overwhelming majority of professional historians, including many Islamic historians studying the early Arab conquests in detail, treat it with deep skepticism, for several converging reasons that are worth walking through carefully, because this particular myth has had an unusually long and politically charged afterlife, often deployed in later centuries, particularly from the European Enlightenment period onward, as a piece of anti-Islamic polemic intended to portray Islamic civilization as inherently hostile to learning and culture, a framing that conveniently overlooks the fact that the same Islamic civilization being slandered in this story would go on, within just a couple of centuries of the Alexandria conquest, to preserve, translate, expand upon, and ultimately transmit back to Europe an enormous portion of the very Greek scientific and philosophical heritage that the Alexandria myth claims Muslims were uniquely hostile toward, through centers of translation and scholarship in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo that became, in their own right, worthy successors to exactly the kind of ambitious, state-sponsored intellectual project the Ptolemies had once pioneered. The most basic problem with the story is its source and timing. The earliest known version of this account appears in the writings of a 13th century Christian physician and historian named Ibn al-Kifti, writing roughly 600 years after the events he describes supposedly took place, with no earlier source corroborating the story in any of the substantial body of historical writing produced by Muslim, Christian, or other historians across those intervening 6 centuries, including writers who had every reason to mention such a dramatic episode had they known of it, particularly Christian chroniclers writing in Egypt itself in the centuries immediately following the conquest, who were not shy about recording grievances against the new Arab rulers when they had genuine grievances to record, and who simply do not mention this specific episode at all. A 600-year gap between an event and its first recorded mention, with total silence from contemporary or near-contemporary sources who would plausibly have recorded it, is, by the ordinary standards historians apply to evaluating ancient and medieval source material, a very strong signal that the story is likely a later legend rather than a reliably transmitted historical memory, the kind of story that accumulates around a famous, semi-mythologized location precisely because people centuries later wanted a dramatic explanation for why something so famous no longer existed, and reached backward to attach that explanation to whichever conquest or conqueror seemed narratively satisfying, regardless of whether the timeline and actually supported it. There is also the more basic underlying problem that, by the time of the Arab conquest in 642, more than 2.5 centuries after Caesar's fire, and roughly 2.5 centuries after the Serapeum's destruction, it is genuinely unclear whether any substantial centralized library collection, comparable to the great Ptolemaic-era institution, still existed in Alexandria at all for Amr ibn al-As's forces to potentially destroy. The city had endured the crisis of the 3rd century in Aurelian's siege in the 270s, the Serapeum's destruction in 391, ongoing civil and religious strife including waves of violence between different Christian theological factions across the 5th and 6th centuries as the broader Christian world fractured into competing doctrinal camps over questions of Christ's nature that produced real and sometimes violent civic unrest within Alexandria itself. A Persian occupation of Egypt in the early 7th century that brought its own disruption, and roughly 3 centuries of generally declining political and economic stability across the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, world more broadly. By the time Arab forces arrived in the 640s, whatever scholarly institutions had once flourished under the early Ptolemies had almost certainly already been reduced to something far smaller and more fragmented. If anything organized and centralized survived in recognizable form at all, making the entire premise of the Caliph Omar story that there existed a single grand library collection simply waiting to be discovered and destroyed by the conquering Arab army, almost certainly anachronistic, projecting the memory of the long-vanished Ptolemaic Golden Age onto a city and an institutional landscape that had already been transformed and diminished through several centuries of unrelated prior decline. So why has this particular story, weak as its evidentiary foundation genuinely is, achieved such enduring popular currency, appearing in countless retellings, documentaries, and casual conversations about the library's fate, often presented as though it were the single definitive explanation? Part of the answer lies in exactly the kind of polemical utility we mentioned a moment ago. European writers from the Enlightenment period onward, working within a broader cultural and political context that frequently sought to portray European, specifically Christian, civilization as the rightful heir and superior continuation of ancient Greek and Roman rational achievement, found it narratively convenient to attribute the loss of that ancient achievement specifically to a non-European, non-Christian conqueror, allowing European readers to mourn the library's loss without having to grapple too directly with the considerably messier reality that the most well-documented and unambiguous act of large-scale destructive religious violence against Alexandria's scholarly institutions, the Serapeum's destruction in 391, had been carried out by Christians against pagans with the explicit endorsement of a Christian Roman emperor, several centuries before any Arab army ever arrived anywhere near Egypt. This is not to suggest that every writer who has repeated the Caliph Omar story over the centuries was consciously engaged in this kind of selective historical framing, since plenty of people innocently repeat a dramatic and widely circulated story without examining its sourcing closely. But it is worth recognizing, as historians increasingly have over recent decades, that the story's persistent popularity cannot be fully separated from the broader pattern of how different civilizations have found it useful, across many centuries, to tell this particular story in whichever way best served their own contemporary cultural and religious narratives, with the actual, considerably more ambiguous historical evidence often treated as distinctly secondary to the story's symbolic and rhetorical convenience. None of this is to suggest that the early Islamic conquests were uniformly benevolent toward pre-existing local cultures and institutions, since the historical record of these conquests, like the historical record of essentially every major military conquest in human history, includes plenty of genuine destruction, disruption, and forced cultural and religious change that should not be minimized or excused. But the specific claim that Caliph Omar personally ordered the deliberate destruction of a still-functioning library of Alexandria appears, on the actual available evidence, to be a later legend rather than a documented historical fact, and responsible historical treatment of this entire story requires holding that distinction clearly, rather than simply repeating whichever version of the destruction narrative happens to be most dramatic or most familiar. So if we step back and try to assemble an honest, evidence-based picture from these several centuries of fragmentary, contradictory, and chronologically scattered ancient sources, what actually happened to the Library of Alexandria? The most defensible answer, the one most consistent with the actual surviving evidence, rather than with any single dramatic legend, is that there was no single library destruction at all, in the sense of one decisive catastrophic event that wiped out an intact, still flourishing institution in a single stroke. Instead, what the evidence supports is a long, gradual, multi-causal decline spanning roughly 7 centuries, involving Caesar's fire in 48 BC, which damaged some portion of the collection, possibly concentrated in harbour area storage rather than the institution's core, ongoing political instability and reduced royal and then imperial patronage across the subsequent centuries of Roman rule, which likely meant a slow attrition of resources, staff, and ambition rather than any single moment of collapse. Serious civic and military violence during the crisis of the 3rd century, particularly Aurelian's siege in the 270s, an episode that receives far less attention than it probably deserves, given its likely significance. The dramatic and well-documented destruction of the Serapeum and its associated daughter collection in 391, carried out by Christian religious authorities with full imperial sanction, which likely eliminated whatever organized pagan scholarly collection still survived by that point. Ongoing religious and political violence across the following centuries, exemplified by but certainly not limited to Hypatia's horrific murder in 415, which created an increasingly hostile and dangerous environment for the kind of open, cross-religious intellectual exchange the institution had once been built around. And finally, a long period of further gradual decline under Byzantine, and then briefly Persian rule, before the Arab conquest in 642, which most likely encountered a city whose great library, in any form resembling its Ptolemaic-era glory, had already been gone, or at minimum drastically diminished, for a very long time, making the popular Caliph Omar story almost certainly a later legend explaining a loss that had, in reality, already happened gradually, for entirely different and considerably less dramatically satisfying reasons, centuries earlier. If we accept this more complicated, gradual picture of decline rather than a single dramatic burning, it raises a question that is, in some ways, even more haunting than the simpler popular story, because a single fire has a clear before and after, a moment when everything changed, but a slow multi-century erosion means the loss was experienced by the actual people living through it, not as one terrible night, but as a slow, almost imperceptible narrowing of possibility, generation after generation, each one inheriting a slightly smaller and more fragmentary version of what their predecessors had once had access to, without any single moment dramatic enough to make anyone fully register, at the time, just how much was quietly slipping away. What, in concrete terms, do we actually know was lost, as opposed to material that survived through other channels, copied and recopied across the centuries by scribes working in monasteries, in the early Islamic world's great translation movements, and eventually in the libraries of Byzantine Constantinople and Renaissance Italy? The honest answer is that we know specific, devastating losses occurred, because ancient sources frequently mention texts and entire bodies of work by named authors that simply do not survive today in any form, sometimes only as a title mentioned in passing by a later writer, sometimes as a handful of quoted fragments preserved because some other surviving author happened to quote a brief passage while making an entirely different point. We know, for instance, that Eratosthenes' major geographical treatise, the work that established a coordinate system for mapping the known world, and that contained his detailed reasoning for the Earth's circumference calculation, does not survive as a complete text. We know it only through the extensive quotations and summaries provided by the later geographer Strabo, meaning our entire understanding of one of antiquity's most important scientific achievements depends on a second-hand account written by someone else entirely, working from what was apparently still a complete copy of Eratosthenes' work in his own time, a copy that has since vanished. Leaving Strabo's second-hand description as our best remaining window into a now-lost original, we know that the historian Manetho, an Egyptian priest writing in the early Ptolemaic period, composed a comprehensive history of Egypt's pharaohs, stretching back thousands of years, organizing Egyptian history into the dynastic structure that modern Egyptology still uses today as its basic chronological framework. And yet Manetho's original work does not survive as a complete text. Known to us only through fragments quoted by later historians, including the Jewish historian Josephus and several early Christian chronographers, each of whom had their own particular interests and selective quoting habits, meaning our entire picture of how an actual ancient Egyptian priest, writing with access to temple records potentially stretching back millennia, understood his own civilization's deep history, comes to us only in scattered, second-hand, and sometimes contradictory fragments, filtered through writers who were not primarily interested in preserving Manetho's work for its own sake, but in using small pieces of it to support their own separate arguments. We know that an enormous body of Greek tragedy and comedy, the plays performed in Athens during the 5th century BC, and for generations afterward, survives today only in a small fraction of its original scale. Of the roughly 90 plays we know Sophocles wrote, only 7 survive complete. Of the considerably larger body of work by Aeschylus, similarly only 7 complete plays remain out of perhaps 70 or more. The comic playwright Menander, whose work was extraordinarily popular and influential across the Hellenistic and Roman worlds, surviving widely enough that wall paintings depicting scenes from his plays have been found as far away as Pompeii in Italy, exists today in only 1 complete play and a substantial number of fragments, despite having written, according to ancient sources, somewhere over 100 works in total. We cannot say with certainty that all of this lost material specifically passed through and was lost from the Library of Alexandria itself, since plenty of ancient literature was lost through purely ordinary processes of cultural neglect, the simple failure of anyone, anywhere, to keep recopying a given text once it fell out of fashion, or once the particular literary or philosophical tradition it represented stopped being actively taught and studied. But Alexandria, as the single largest concentration of exactly this kind of literary material in the ancient world, was almost certainly home to at least some meaningful fraction of texts that do not survive in any form today. Texts whose specific content, whose individual sentences and ideas and stories are simply gone, not paraphrased or summarized anywhere, not quoted even in fragmentary form by any surviving later author, lost as completely and as silently as if they had never been written at all. This is, when you sit with it for long enough, a genuinely strange and melancholy thing to try to hold in your mind. The idea that there exist, or once existed, entire complete human creative and intellectual works, products of real individual minds working with real skill and effort across months or years of their lives, that have left behind no trace whatsoever, not even the kind of second-hand fragmentary echo that lets us at least partially reconstruct what Eratosthenes or Manetho were trying to say. We do not know what we do not know. We cannot even produce a reliable list of everything that has been lost, because a great deal of what was lost has been lost so completely that we no longer have any record that it ever existed in the first place, meaning the true scale of the loss associated with Alexandria's long decline is not merely large but genuinely unknowable, an absence so total that we cannot even properly measure the shape of what is missing. And yet, against this genuinely sobering picture of loss, it is important to hold an equally true and considerably more hopeful counter-narrative, because the popular image of Alexandria's destruction sometimes implies a far more total intellectual catastrophe than what the historical record actually supports. As though the entire body of Greek scientific and philosophical achievement simply vanished from human knowledge in one stroke, never to be recovered, when the reality is considerably more encouraging, even if it required an extraordinarily long and circuitous historical journey to get there. A great deal of the most significant Alexandrian and broader Greek scholarly achievement did survive, not because the original scrolls in Alexandria's library managed to physically endure the centuries, since the overwhelming majority of them almost certainly did not, papyrus being an inherently fragile material that requires active, continuous recopying onto fresh material every few generations simply to survive at all under ordinary conditions, with or without any dramatic fire or act of deliberate destruction, but because the texts themselves, the actual words and ideas, had already been copied widely enough, distributed across enough different cities and collections throughout the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, during the centuries when Alexandria's scholarly culture was at its height, that the destruction or decline of any single collection, even the largest and most famous one, did not mean those texts vanished from human access entirely. Euclid's Elements survived, copied and recopied across the Byzantine world, translated into Arabic by early Islamic scholars, working in the Great Translation movement centered in Baghdad during the 8th and 9th centuries, a deliberate, state-sponsored intellectual project under the early Abbasid Caliphate that, in its scale, ambition and structure, bears a genuinely striking resemblance to what the early Ptolemies had once built in Alexandria itself, complete with royal patronage, salaried scholars, and an aggressive program of acquiring and translating texts from multiple older intellectual traditions, in this case not only Greek but also Persian and Indian sources, into a single common scholarly language, in this case Arabic rather than Greek. Ptolemy the astronomer's Almagest survived through this same Arabic translation tradition, its very name in most modern languages derived from the Arabic title given to it by these translators Almagisti, meaning the greatest, a title that travelled back into European languages centuries later as the work was eventually translated again, this time from Arabic into Latin, becoming available to medieval European scholars who had largely lost direct access to the original Greek text and who depended on this long, multi-stage chain of translation and preservation, stretching from ancient Alexandria through medieval Baghdad and eventually through translation centers in Islamic Spain, to recover scientific and mathematical knowledge their own more immediate cultural ancestors had largely lost access to during the political and economic disruptions of the early medieval period in Western Europe. This Arabic preservation and translation tradition deserves far more attention and credit than it often receives in popular Western tellings of this story, precisely because the popular narrative so often jumps directly from ancient Alexandria to the European Renaissance, as though Greek learning simply went dormant for 1,000 years before being magically rediscovered by enthusiastic Italian humanists in the 14 and 1500s, when the actual history is that this knowledge never went dormant at all. It simply continued developing and being actively used, studied, and built upon within the Islamic world throughout the entire period that European popular memory sometimes treats as a kind of intellectual dark age. Scholars working in Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and eventually Cordoba in Islamic Spain did not merely passively preserve Greek texts like museum curators protecting fragile artifacts. They actively engaged with the material, identified errors and gaps in the existing Greek mathematical and astronomical tradition, developed entirely new mathematical fields including algebra, whose very name derives from the Arabic title of a foundational treatise written by the Baghdad-based mathematician al-Khwarizmi, advanced medicine considerably beyond where Galen and the earlier Alexandrian physicians had left it, and eventually transmitted this expanded, improved body of combined Greek and Islamic scientific knowledge back into Western Europe, primarily through Islamic Spain and Sicily, where it was translated yet again, this time from Arabic into Latin, fueling the explosive growth of medieval European universities and eventually feeding directly into the scientific revolution of the 16 and 1700s. So the most accurate way to understand Alexandria's true legacy is not as a single tragic story of total irrecoverable loss, however real and however significant the genuine losses were, but as the origin point of an extraordinarily long, complicated, multi-civilizational relay race, in which knowledge first gathered and systematized in a single Egyptian harbour city under Greek Macedonian royal patronage was carried forward, transformed, expanded, occasionally nearly lost, and then rescued again. Translated across at least 3 or 4 major language barriers across the centuries, Greek to Arabic, Arabic to Latin, eventually into the vernacular languages of modern Europe, passed between civilizations that did not always view each other charitably, and that were sometimes in direct military and religious conflict with one another, and yet that each, in their own turn, recognized something valuable enough in this inherited body of mathematical, astronomical, medical, and philosophical knowledge to keep carrying it forward, generation after generation, century after century, until pieces of what Eratosthenes calculated, and what Euclid proved, and what Hero of Alexandria built eventually found their way. After a journey of well over 1,000 years, and through the hands of dozens of intervening civilizations and translators, whose individual names are mostly forgotten, into the foundations of the modern scientific and mathematical world that all of us, whether we realize it or not, still live inside today. In the centuries following the Arab conquest, Alexandria itself continued as an important Egyptian port city, but it gradually lost the singular, unmatched prestige it had once held as the unquestioned intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world, its population and political importance both declining considerably under medieval Islamic rule compared to its ancient peak, while the center of gravity for Egyptian political life shifted toward Cairo, founded by Arab and later Fatimid rulers as a new capital further inland along the Nile, a city that itself eventually developed its own enormously significant centers of Islamic learning, including the mosque and University of Al-Azhar, founded in the 10th century and still operating today as one of the oldest continuously functioning institutions of higher learning anywhere in the world, a kind of distant institutional echo in a very different religious and cultural context of the same basic impulse toward gathering scholars and texts in one place that had once animated Alexandria's Maushin. The physical site of the ancient library, meanwhile, essentially disappeared from view, both literally and in terms of any precise collective memory of exactly where it had once stood. Centuries of earthquakes, including several significant ones across the medieval period, caused substantial portions of ancient Alexandria's royal quarter, including the area most strongly associated with the Ptolemaic-era palace complex and the original Mausian, to subside beneath the waters of Alexandria's eastern harbour, while the parts of the ancient city that remained above water were continuously built over, rebuilt, and built over again by successive generations of Alexandria's medieval and modern inhabitants, layering new construction directly atop ancient foundations in the way that happens in almost every long-inhabited Mediterranean city, making any straightforward archaeological excavation of the specific site enormously difficult, since you cannot easily dig beneath a modern, densely populated, continuously inhabited city centre, the way you might excavate a more isolated and abandoned ancient ruin elsewhere in the world. This underwater dimension of Alexandria's lost history has, however, become the subject of genuinely exciting archaeological work over the past several decades, particularly through the efforts of underwater archaeologists, most notably the French archaeologist Franck Goddio, whose team has spent years conducting careful underwater surveys and excavations of Alexandria's eastern harbour, recovering an extraordinary range of submerged material, including portions of the ancient royal palace complex, fragments of monumental statuary, including colossal pharaonic-style statues that were apparently set up by the Ptolemies to associate their own Greek-Macedonian rule with the much older tradition of native Egyptian pharaonic kingship, sunken obelisks, and remains of the ancient harbour infrastructure itself, work that has given modern historians and archaeologists a far more detailed physical sense of what the royal quarter of ancient Alexandria actually looked like than was available even a few decades ago, even though, frustratingly, no one has yet definitively located and excavated anything that can be confidently identified as the specific physical remains of the library building or the Mausian complex itself, meaning the precise architectural reality of the building everyone has been discussing for the past several hours of this story remains, even now, a matter of educated reconstruction rather than direct physical confirmation. Other archaeological work, conducted on dry land within the modern city, has been similarly suggestive without being fully conclusive. A Polish-Egyptian archaeological mission, working since the 1960s at a site called Kom El Dika in central Alexandria, uncovered the remains of a complex including a series of lecture halls arranged with stepped, auditorium-style seating clearly designed for teaching and oral instruction, dating to the Roman imperial period. Several centuries after the original Ptolemaic Mausian would have been founded, but potentially representing either a later phase or a related successor institution to the original scholarly tradition. A physical space where actual ancient teaching clearly took place, even if we cannot say with certainty that this specific complex is identical to, or directly descended from, the original library and Mausian of the early Ptolemies. It offers at minimum tangible physical evidence that organized, architecturally purpose-built higher education was indeed taking place in Alexandria for a very long span of its history, supporting the broader textual evidence even where it cannot pin down the exact location and fate of the most famous original building. In a fitting and deliberately symbolic gesture toward this long and complicated history, the modern Egyptian government, with substantial international support, including funding and expertise from UNESCO and numerous countries and private donors around the world, constructed a new library in Alexandria, called the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, opened in 2002 on a site near the university and reportedly close to where some of the ancient royal quarter is believed to have once stood, a strikingly modern building, its most distinctive architectural feature being a vast tilted disc roof, designed to evoke either a rising sun or an open book, depending on which architectural commentary you read, with a granite wall surrounding the building inscribed with characters and symbols from numerous different writing systems used throughout human history, an intentional gesture toward the same kind of universal, cross-cultural ambition that had once animated the original Ptolemaic project. The new library was built to hold several million volumes, includes substantial digital archiving and research facilities, and operates today as a genuinely active scholarly and cultural institution, hosting conferences, supporting ongoing archaeological and historical research into Alexandria's ancient past, and serving, quite explicitly and self-consciously, as a modern successor attempting to recapture at least the spirit, if obviously not any direct physical continuity, of the ancient institution whose name and reputation it deliberately and proudly invokes. It is, in its own way, a genuinely moving gesture. An entire modern nation choosing to invest considerable resources into rebuilding, in spirit if not in literal physical fact, an institution that had been gone for well over 1,000 years, simply because the idea of what that institution had once represented, however distorted or romanticized, that idea has become across the intervening centuries of retelling, still felt worth honouring and attempting, in some partial and necessarily imperfect way, to recreate. He let us return for a while longer to something we touched on earlier but did not fully linger over, because it deserves more attention than a brief mention allows, and it gives us a genuinely vivid sense of what the actual daily intellectual work inside Alexandria's library looked like, beyond the grand headline achievements of measuring planets and translating scriptures. The scholarly disputes over Homer's text, which occupied generations of Alexandrian editors after Zenodotus, were not a single quick fix applied once and then settled forever. They were an ongoing, multi-generational argument conducted with real intellectual seriousness and real personal rivalry about what exactly the most famous poet in the Greek world had actually written. And that argument tells us a great deal about the values this institution was quietly built around. After Zenodotus's pioneering but admittedly somewhat blunt first attempt at establishing a critical text, later Alexandrian scholars refined the methodology considerably. Aristophanes of Byzantium, who served as a librarian in the early 2nd century BC, developed a more sophisticated set of editorial symbols for marking different kinds of textual problems, distinguishing, for instance, between a line he believed was a genuine but questionable Homeric verse, and a line he believed had been inserted by a later hand entirely, a distinction that required real interpretive judgment rather than simple mechanical comparison of manuscripts. He is also credited with developing or significantly refining the system of Greek accent marks and breathing marks that still appear in printed Greek texts today. Diacritical notation designed to help readers, especially readers for whom Greek was not their first language, an increasingly large and important population as the Hellenistic world expanded across regions where Greek was the language of administration and culture, but not necessarily anyone's native tongue, correctly pronounce words whose accentuation might otherwise be ambiguous on the page. This may sound like a small technical detail, but it represents something genuinely significant about how Alexandria's scholars thought about their work, which is that they were not merely preserving texts for an already expert audience of native Greek speakers, who already knew exactly how every word should sound. They were actively building tools to make these texts accessible to an increasingly diverse multilingual readership, spread across an enormous geographic area, from Egypt to Syria to the edges of India. Anywhere Alexander's conquests and the subsequent Hellenistic kingdoms had spread Greek as a language of government and culture. The culmination of this multi-generational editorial project came with Aristarchus of Samothrace, not to be confused with the earlier astronomer Aristarchus of Samos we discussed previously. A frustrating coincidence of similar names that even ancient writers occasionally confused. This second Aristarchus, working in the 2nd century BC, produced what later ancient scholars generally regarded as the most authoritative and carefully reasoned edition of Homer that the Alexandrian tradition would ultimately produce, supported by detailed commentaries explaining the reasoning behind his editorial choices, line by line, in a level of explicit methodological transparency that we do not see matched again in approaches to literary scholarship for a very long time afterward. He compared regional manuscript traditions, considered questions of internal consistency within the broader Homeric narrative, weighed linguistic evidence about whether certain vocabulary or grammatical forms were plausible for the very ancient period in which Homer was believed to have composed his poems, and built arguments, transparent and checkable arguments, for why he believed certain disputed lines belonged in the authoritative text and certain others did not. Later Greek and Roman scholars treated Aristarchus's edition with such respect that copies of Homer descending from his particular editorial tradition appear to have substantially shaped the text of the Iliad and Odyssey that eventually became standard throughout the rest of antiquity, and that, through an unbroken chain of subsequent copying across the Byzantine Middle Ages, ultimately survives and underlies the versions of Homer that modern readers still read today, in translation or in the original Greek, meaning that when you or anyone else picks up a modern printed copy of the Iliad, the specific sequence of lines you are reading has been shaped, in ways most readers never realize, by editorial decisions made by scholars working in Alexandria more than 2,000 years ago, arguing with each other across generations about which lines a poet, who may himself have lived centuries before any of them were born, had actually composed. This entire tradition of disciplined, evidence-based textual argument, conducted across generations by scholars who respected and built upon, while also sometimes vigorously disputing, their predecessors' specific conclusions, represents one of Alexandria's most genuinely underappreciated legacies, because it established, in concrete practice rather than merely as abstract philosophical principle, the idea that even our most beloved and culturally central texts deserve careful, skeptical, evidence-based scrutiny rather than simple unquestioning reverence, and that scholarly disagreement, conducted with rigor and mutual respect for evidence, is not a threat to a text's importance, but actually the process through which we arrive at our best possible understanding of what that text actually says and means. This is again, recognizably the same intellectual lineage that biblical textual critics, Shakespearean scholars debating which folio or quarto preserves the most authentic version of a particular play, and modern editors of any historically significant text with a complicated manuscript history are still working within today, whether or not they consciously trace their methodological ancestry back to the scroll rooms of ancient Alexandria. It is worth returning, too, to the rivalry with Pergamon that we mentioned briefly earlier, because it deserves a slightly fuller telling, partly because it is genuinely entertaining as a piece of ancient institutional pettiness, and partly because it illustrates something important about how seriously the ancient world had come to regard the prestige value of a great library by this point in history. The Attalid dynasty ruling the kingdom of Pergamon in Asia Minor, having grown wealthy and politically significant in their own right during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, deliberately set out to build a rival library that could compete with Alexandria's prestige, recruiting scholars, commissioning texts, and constructing what ancient sources describe as an institution genuinely comparable in ambition, if probably not in ultimate scale, to the Alexandrian Mausian. The later Roman writer Plutarch, in his biography of Mark Antony, reports the dramatic and possibly somewhat exaggerated claim that Antony, as a gift to Cleopatra, transferred 200,000 scrolls from the Pergamon library to Alexandria, a story that, if even roughly accurate in its scale, suggests that by the late 1st century BC, Pergamon's collection had grown to a size genuinely rivaling Alexandria's own, making this entire episode of recorded library rivalry, the rumoured papyrus export ban, the parchment innovation story, and finally this dramatic mass transfer of scrolls as a romantic political gift, a small but vivid illustration of just how much real-world political and cultural weight a great library collection had come to carry among the ruling elites of the ancient Mediterranean world by this point, treated as seriously as territory, as seriously as military alliances, as a genuine strategic and prestige asset worth fighting, legislating, and apparently even romancing over. Let us also spend a bit more time properly with the great translation movement centered in Baghdad, because it is genuinely one of the most direct and consequential continuations of exactly the Alexandrian project. Even though it unfolded in an entirely different language, religion, and political context several centuries later, and because understanding it in real detail helps dissolve, more thoroughly than a brief mention can, the lingering popular misconception that ancient Greek learning simply vanished from the world for 1,000 years between antiquity and the European Renaissance, beginning in earnest under the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th century, and reaching a particularly intense and well-organized phase under Caliph al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century. An institution traditionally known as the House of Wisdom, located in Baghdad, became the organizing center for an enormous, deliberately state-sponsored project of translating Greek scientific, philosophical, and mathematical texts into Arabic, supplemented by similarly ambitious translations from Persian and Sanskrit sources, creating a genuinely synthesized body of combined Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge that Islamic scholars then proceeded to actively extend, correct, and substantially improve upon, rather than merely preserving it unchanged. The translators involved in this project, including figures like Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Christian Arab physician and scholar, whose translations of Galen's medical texts and various other Greek scientific works were so numerous and so carefully done that they remained the standard reference translations for centuries afterward, approached their work with a level of philological care that directly echoes the methods pioneered by the Alexandrian editors centuries earlier, comparing multiple available Greek manuscripts where they could obtain them, often through extensive and expensive efforts to acquire texts from Byzantine territory, sometimes through direct diplomatic exchange, in which Abbasid rulers explicitly requested specific Greek manuscripts as part of treaty negotiations with the Byzantine Empire. A fascinating echo of the way the early Ptolemies had once aggressively pursued texts through diplomatic, and sometimes less than fully scrupulous means. The mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, working in this same Baghdad intellectual environment in the early 9th century, drew on the inherited Greek mathematical tradition, including the Alexandrian legacy running through Euclid and beyond, while also incorporating mathematical concepts and techniques from Indian sources, including India's crucial development of a positional decimal number system, with a true zero, something the Greek mathematical tradition itself had never fully developed despite its enormous sophistication in geometry, and from this synthesis produced foundational work in what would come to be called algebra, a word derived directly from the Arabic title of his most influential treatise. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is a genuinely beautiful illustration of exactly the kind of multi-civilizational synthesis this whole story has been circling around. The geometric rigor of the Greek tradition, refined and systematized by Euclid, working in Alexandria under Ptolemaic patronage, met the numerical innovations of Indian mathematics, were synthesized by a scholar working in Baghdad under Abbasid Islamic patronage, and the resulting hybrid achievement, neither purely Greek nor purely Indian, but something genuinely new built from both inheritances, eventually travelled onward into medieval and Renaissance Europe, where it would become foundational to the entire subsequent development of Western mathematics, all of which raises the question of how meaningful it really is to talk about any single civilization owning or being uniquely responsible for the accumulated mathematical and scientific knowledge that humanity collectively possesses today, when the actual history of how that knowledge developed and spread looks, on close examination, far more like an enormous, centuries-long, multi-civilizational collaborative project, passed forward hand-to-hand across cultures that frequently viewed each other with suspicion or outright hostility, than like the achievement of any single triumphant tradition working in isolation from all the others. The astronomer Ibn al-Shatir, working in Damascus in the 14th century, building on this entire inherited and continuously developed tradition, running back through Baghdad to Alexandria's Claudius Ptolemy, developed mathematical models for planetary motion that some modern historians of science have noted bear a striking mathematical resemblance to models that Nicolaus Copernicus would propose in Europe roughly 2 centuries later, raising genuinely live and still debated scholarly questions about exactly how much direct or indirect influence Islamic astronomical work, transmitted through channels modern historians have not yet fully traced with certainty, may have had on the European astronomers who eventually overturned the long-dominant Ptolemaic, Earth-centered model of the cosmos, the very same model that had itself originated, many centuries earlier, from careful mathematical work conducted in Roman-era Alexandria. By the time this enormous multi-century, multi-civilizational chain of preservation, translation, and active scientific development finally fed into the European intellectual revival we call the Renaissance, beginning substantially in Italy from the 14th century onward, and then into the scientific revolution of the 16 and 1700s. The specific original scrolls that had once sat in numbered compartments along the walls of the ancient Alexandrian Mausion had been gone, completely and irrecoverably as physical objects, for the better part of 1,000 years or more. And yet an extraordinary amount of what had actually been thought, calculated, proven, and written down within those vanished walls had, against every reasonable expectation, survived anyway, carried forward not by any single continuous institution, but by an almost unimaginably long and circuitous relay of human effort and care, stretching across languages, religions, and civilizations that often had very little else in common with one another, united only by a shared, stubborn, remarkably durable conviction that this particular body of inherited knowledge, however it had originally come into being, and however many hands it had passed through since, was worth the very considerable trouble of keeping alive. Stepping back now from the specific sequence of events, the kings and the conquerors, the mathematicians and the murdered philosopher, the fires that were real and the fires that were later legend, it is worth asking what this entire long story actually means, why it has retained such a powerful grip on human imagination for so many centuries, in a way that other lost ancient institutions, of which there were certainly many, have not managed to achieve. Other libraries existed in the ancient world. Pergamon's rival collection, which we mentioned earlier, was itself enormous and significant, and it too eventually vanished. Its fate, similarly uncertain and similarly fought over by later historians. Yet Pergamon's library does not occupy anything like the same place in popular imagination that Alexandria's does. Rome itself housed several major public libraries during the imperial period, and these too were eventually lost amid the slow unraveling of Roman political and economic infrastructure across late antiquity. Yet we do not have entire popular documentaries and best-selling books built specifically around mourning the loss of the library of Trajan's Forum, the way we do around Alexandria. Part of the answer surely lies in simple scale and reputation, since Alexandria really was, by the consistent testimony of essentially every ancient source that mentions it, considered the largest and most prestigious such institution in the ancient Mediterranean world, the gold standard against which every other ambitious royal or civic library project measured itself, meaning its loss, whatever the actual messy multi-century reality behind that loss, carried correspondingly greater symbolic weight than the loss of any merely large but not singularly unmatched collection elsewhere. But there is something more than mere scale at work here, something that connects Alexandria's story to exactly the same deep, recurring human psychological pattern we encounter again and again across very different historical and even mythological contexts, the story of a golden age of human achievement followed by a fall, a story whose emotional power does not actually depend on the specific historical details being perfectly accurate, but on the underlying shape of the narrative itself, a shape that resonates with something fundamental in how humans process the passage of time and the fragility of their own collective achievements. This is, when you think about it carefully, structurally almost identical to the emotional core of Plato's story of Atlantis, a magnificent civilization, confident in its own permanence and significance, brought low, not necessarily through any single dramatic external attack, but through a complicated combination of internal political dysfunction, the slow erosion of the conditions that had once allowed it to flourish, and eventually a catastrophe, or in Alexandria's case, a series of smaller catastrophes spread across centuries that finished what gradual decline had already substantially begun. We tell ourselves the story of Alexandria's lost library for many of the same psychological reasons we tell ourselves the story of Atlantis, because both stories let us grapple, at a safe historical distance, with genuinely uncomfortable questions about whether our own civilization's current achievements, whatever they happen to be in whatever era we are living through, are actually as permanent and secure as we tend to assume they are in the ordinary unreflective business of daily life. Alexandria is, in this sense, considerably more useful and more honest than Atlantis as a vehicle for this kind of reflection, precisely because Alexandria, unlike Atlantis, definitely existed, definitely achieved everything this story has described, and definitely did decline and eventually vanish in some recognizable form, meaning the lesson it offers about the fragility of intellectual and cultural achievement carries the full weight of documented historical reality rather than the more comfortably distant weight of pure philosophical allegory. And the lesson, when we actually sit with the documented historical specifics rather than the more romantic popular legend, turns out to be more nuanced and in some ways more genuinely useful than the simple morality tale version, where one villain burns one building in one terrible night. The real story of Alexandria's decline teaches something quieter and arguably more important, which is that institutions of learning and culture do not typically die from a single dramatic blow, however much our storytelling instincts want to locate one. They die far more often from a slow accumulation of smaller failures, reduced funding here, a few years of political instability there, an increasingly hostile and intolerant social and religious environment somewhere else, until the cumulative weight of all these individually survivable problems eventually overwhelms an institution's capacity to keep functioning in anything like its original form. Caesar's fire alone did not destroy Alexandria's library. Several centuries of inconsistent Roman administrative attention, combined with the catastrophic mid-3rd century crisis, combined with the specific and well-documented religious violence of 391, combined with the murder of Hypatia and the broader climate of intolerance that murder both reflected and intensified, combined with further centuries of gradual Byzantine-era decline, together accomplished what no single fire, however dramatic, could have accomplished on its own. This is, in its own quiet way, perhaps a more genuinely alarming lesson than the simple burning library story, because it suggests that the kind of institutional and cultural decline that eventually consumed Alexandria's achievement is not necessarily the result of some single, easily identifiable, dramatically evil act that we can simply resolve never to repeat. It is the result of a long accumulation of smaller, individually almost reasonable scene choices and circumstances, reduced funding during a difficult budget year, an understandable but consequential shift in political priorities, a religious or ideological conflict that seems, in the moment, to have nothing directly to do with libraries or scholarship at all, that together, slowly and almost invisibly, hollow out an institution's capacity to keep doing what it once did, until one day, looking back across a span of decades or centuries, people realize that something genuinely irreplaceable has quietly slipped away, without anyone at any single point along the way feeling fully responsible for having caused it. There is also something worth dwelling on, in these final moments before we let this story rest, about the specific individuals whose names we have spent the past several hours following through this long history. because their stories, considered together, capture something genuinely beautiful about the underlying human impulse that built Alexandria in the first place. An impulse that long outlasted the specific physical building and the specific royal dynasty that funded it. Eratosthenes, measuring the circumference of an entire planet using nothing more than a stick, a shadow, and a well in a city he had likely never personally visited, combined with an unshakable confidence in the power of careful reasoning to reach genuine truths about the physical world. Callimachus, patiently constructing a bibliographic catalogue of hundreds of thousands of scrolls, an almost unimaginably tedious task by any ordinary measure, performed out of a conviction that organizing access to existing knowledge was itself a form of genuine intellectual contribution, every bit as valuable as producing new knowledge from scratch. Hypatia, teaching mathematics and philosophy to students from across every religious and social background her dangerous and increasingly polarized city contained, maintaining genuine intellectual and personal respect across lines that an increasing number of people around her were finding it easier and safer to treat as absolute and unbridgeable, right up until that very openness and that very prominence cost her life. The anonymous Jewish scholars translating their community's sacred texts into a new language for a new generation who could no longer easily read the old one, never imagining that their careful, practical translation choices would eventually shape the theological vocabulary of an entirely new world religion that did not yet exist when they began their work. The unnamed scribes and translators, working centuries later in Baghdad, carrying forward and actively improving upon a body of Greek mathematical and astronomical knowledge that had been gathered, centuries before their own lifetimes, by scholars working for a dynasty of foreign Greek kings ruling over Egypt, in a language and a cultural tradition not their own, simply because the knowledge itself seemed worth preserving and extending, regardless of where it had originally come from. What connects all of these very different people across many centuries and several entirely different civilizations, languages, and religious traditions is a shared conviction that turning out to be one of the most durable and one of the most genuinely admirable threads running through the whole of human history. The conviction that organized, carefully gathered, carefully verified knowledge is worth the very considerable trouble of collecting, preserving, and passing forward, even when, especially when, the people doing that work cannot possibly know in advance which future civilization, speaking which future language, facing which future crisis, might eventually need exactly the specific piece of knowledge they are currently working so carefully to preserve. Eratosthenes had no way of knowing that a Renaissance Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus would, many centuries later, badly underestimate the size of the Earth, partly because he relied on a different and less accurate ancient calculation than Eratosthenes' own considerably more correct figure. Sailing west across the Atlantic, genuinely believing Asia lay only a few thousand miles away, a navigational miscalculation that, through one of history's stranger ironies, led directly to the European encounter with the Americas, precisely because the wrong ancient number was used instead of the right one that had been sitting, largely unconsulted at that specific moment, in the long-inherited record of Alexandrian scholarship. The chain of consequence running from a 3rd century BC Egyptian well and a shadow's careful measurement, all the way to the European discovery of an entire previously unknown hemisphere 17 centuries later, is exactly the kind of wildly unpredictable, multi-century causal thread that this whole story has tried to trace again and again through translation chains and conquests and fires and quiet acts of scholarly devotion. And it is precisely this unpredictability, the genuine impossibility of ever knowing in advance which piece of carefully preserved knowledge will eventually matter, and to whom that makes the entire patient, multi-generational project of libraries, archives, and scholarship in Alexandria and in every other place across history that has attempted something similar feel less like an optional cultural luxury and more like one of the genuinely essential, quietly heroic undertakings that civilizations can choose to invest in or choose to neglect, with consequences that may not become fully apparent for centuries, long after everyone involved in the original choice has been forgotten. The Library of Alexandria, in the end, teaches us that knowledge is never actually safe, not permanently, not anywhere, not in any single building, no matter how grand, no matter how many scrolls it holds, or how many brilliant scholars walk its covered colonnades, discussing geometry and astronomy in the warm Egyptian evening air. It teaches us that the conditions allowing genuine open inquiry to flourish, the conditions that let an Eratosthenes calculate the Earth's size, or a Hypatia teach philosophy to students of every background without fear, are considerably more fragile, more dependent on a continuous chain of political stability, social tolerance, and sustained collective will, than the confident, settled grandeur of the institution at its height ever suggested to the people living comfortably within it. And yet it also teaches us, in the same breath and with equal force, that knowledge, once it has been gathered, written down, copied, and shared widely enough, across enough different minds and enough different places, is remarkably difficult to extinguish entirely, that it tends to survive, fragmented and transformed and passed hand to hand across civilizations that do not always like each other very much, in ways that no single conqueror, no single fire, no single act of deliberate or accidental destruction, however devastating in the moment, has ever quite managed to fully erase. The specific scrolls that once sat in their numbered compartments along the walls of the ancient Maushan are gone. All of them, every single physical object, lost to fire or flood, or the simple slow decay of organic material left untended for too many centuries. But an enormous amount of what those particular scrolls actually contained, the ideas, the calculations, the careful comparative readings of Homer, the anatomical observations, the geometric proofs, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, given how completely the original institution eventually vanished, made its way forward anyway, through Baghdad and Cordoba and Byzantine Constantinople and Renaissance Florence, all the way to this very moment, reaching you now, on whatever device you are using to listen to this story, in whatever room you are lying in as the night settles in around you, carried forward across more than 2,000 years and through more civilizations than any of the people who originally wrote those words down could possibly have imagined. Simply because enough people, in enough different times and places, decided that what had been gathered in that long-vanished Egyptian harbour city was worth the trouble of saving. And so the long story of Alexandria's library quietly comes to rest, not in any single dramatic ending, because it never really had one, but in this slow layered accumulation of loss and rescue, fire and translation, conquest and quiet scholarly devotion, stretching from a young king's ambitious vision on a strip of Egyptian coastline, all the way to a tilted glass roof rising again on that same coast more than 2,000 years later, and onward, even now, into whatever comes next. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting for you. Just let your eyes find it when you are ready. And if tonight's journey meant something to you, a like, a subscribe, or a thought left in the comments below would mean a great deal. For now, let your body go heavy. Let your shoulders sink fully into wherever you are resting. Close your eyes. The harbour is quiet. The great lighthouse has gone dark. The scrolls, wherever they finally came to rest, are still. Sleep well. Sweet dreams.